Welcome everyone to the Wawenoc chapter of the Maine Genealogical Society. I'm good. I'm good. This afternoon, Penny West is going to speak with us, and I asked her what I should say. And the only thing she gave me for information was that she's lived in Waldo County since 1979, which is longer than most of us. No, I know the ones that are born here. But most of us are from away. The rest of anyway, Penny, I will let you talk about your relative.
Okay.
Wonderful letters.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for coming. I'm very pleased to be here. The library includes me with my description of my grandfather's life, my great grandfather's life. Can you talk about these? Am I not speaking loud enough? How about this? Is that better?
Yes.
Okay.
She could use the traveling mic because your voice doesn't carry. The voice is not carrying.
So thank you for coming. Happy to be here. And these are the letters of Gus Farley Jr., who is 17 years old. He's writing from London during the Civil War years, 1861 to 1864 was when he was there. And now I have another little, oh, she disappeared. I don't know how to get rid of calling somebody's in the waiting room.
I think she's getting you a microphone.
Okay. Yeah. And we have somebody in the waiting room too.
There's an admit up there at the top right. There's
Hello? Is that better?
Yes.
Okay.
We keep it up there.
Oh, right.
People always drop it.
Oh, right. I'll make it bigger. And we'll let the people come into the waiting room.
DJ. Admin.
Are you coming? So more people need to come in?
Yeah.
Oh, did I come in with you? I didn't know that. Anything. You just disappear. All right. I don't advance. I'll just hit the button, right?
Oh, yep. Oh, just the arrows.
I'm not getting anything announced. Okay. All right. So I was not planning on writing a book. I was in London in a youth hostel, standing in line for breakfast, and Satsuki Yamashita was behind me. And as a conversational piece, I said, "Oh, my grandfather, the young man here, was born in Japan." And she got very excited. And this is the author of the letters here in 1880. And so when she went back to Japan, she found his tea label, where you can see if I can make these work. So there's Farley is the last name. You can see Farley. And they found out, she sent me a map of Yokohama showing where his place of business was. So I got excited. And then it turned out that my cousin had letters. And he had a stash of 90 letters that Gus had written home from London. So I started to read them and put them in order. And then I had to find out what they were all about, what things referred to. And I didn't really know who he was. Then just recently, the way things happen with people down south is I got a picture of him. So this is what he looked like when he was writing the letters, and this picture was actually taken in London. And to whom was he writing? I'm just going to give a little bit of backstory for him, even though I found out the backstory bits and pieces as I was going through the letters, as I found out I needed to know more. So there's his father, Gus Sr., there's his mother, Amelia Frederica Newman, and these are some of the that were alive when he was writing. And Gus, of course, is the young man on the right. Then we have his sister, Caroline or Carrie here in the blue. And then there's Eunice, Miss Spriggs Cotton, and then there's little Lizzie or Elizabeth over there. And Eunice did some writing of letters in the 1925 or so, and she wrote, "As I was one of the children in this picture, I can tell you all about our dear big brother, who we thought was the nicest and the handsomest boy in the world, who was always whistling and turning somersaults and singing, and the only reason he ever got scolded was because he was not fond of study, and he left his lessons to the last thing. In the spring, he played marbles, and we liked to have him pull them out of his pockets and tell us how much they were worth in money. He was a great favorite in the kitchen, and the cook always saved a piece of pie or cake for him." So it was so nice to have like almost primary information about him and from a sibling. And then I had to figure out where Gus was from. I hadn't really thought much about this branch of the family. And the same young woman, Eunice, wrote, well, actually, she was in her 80s when she wrote that other letter, but she wrote this in 1923. And it was a trip that the family took from Chelsea, which is down here at the bottom of the yellow line, up to Ipswich. And let's see, so they headed out and they got up there. It was 26 miles and they got there in a day. And the good old horse Katie pulled the carryall. And so carryall was another word that I didn't have a clue what it was. So I got to do a little research and find out what a carryall was. And in the description, the father and Gus, the letter writer, got to sit up in the front, and then the mother with the 3 little girls sat in the back, and they made it all the way up the road to Ipswich. And see, oops, go away. And so I did something wrong. Aha, there we go. And where were they going? They were going to Aunt Caroline Lord's house. And then I got to meet the people in Ipswich Historical Society. I said, where do you think this house was that they were going? And they kindly showed me the picture, and it met the description of how there was a tiny little entryway and a very steep stairway. And in the back, the children slept in a huge feather bed with a trundle bed underneath. And it gave a description. And you can sort of see in this picture that there is a tree in the back. Well, the minute the children got out of the carryall, they swarmed up the tree and were eating cherries. So it was really kind of fun to find out where they were going and what they were going to be doing. And then a little bit about the father. So it turned out that the Farleys had been tanners and merchants for many years. They'd come to Ipswich in 1674, and they'd been there for many years. But Gus's father had to follow work, and he went down to Chelsea, and he worked on the wharves as a broker. So from being a tanner to a broker of hides was what happened. And in the Industrial Revolution, the shoemaking business changed from being itinerant shoemakers that would come to your house with a last and make different shoes for your family. They had started to have factories. And of course, once you get the factory, the procurer of the hides is not going to be buy them 1 or 2 from various, farms and families. They want to get in en masse. And if you have read 2 Years Before the Mast, which was written in 1939 by Dana, it is a journey of a young Harvard sophomore who got measles, so his eyes were weak. So he decided to take a road trip. So he went on a ship all the way around the Horn and up to California to collect the Spanish hides and take them back for the hide company. So there really is a maritime trade. Other hides came from Calcutta, which I thought was fascinating. I mean, I had no idea there was such an international trade in hides. But anyway, what we're seeing here is this is Long Wharf here, and then India Wharf is over here. Down here is, there we go, there's Quincy Market. Okay, there's Quincy Market. And then down here in yellow is Faneuil Hall. And right over here is Two Change Ave, which is where this is Two Change Ave here, where his office was as a broker. And what you're also seeing on the waterfront is a combination of sail and steam, because we're in the transition between all sailing and sailboats. There we go. Now the father, this is another wonderful piece of information that came to me with, once somebody knows that you're sort of collecting the material, it funnels towards you. So this is from 1828, and this is what the father of the letter writer, when he was 14 at school, he took a cruise with an uncle to St. Thomas, and he wrote it up for his school thing. He's about 14 years old, and I do feel sorry for him. Here it is, 1828, ridiculous composition, not fit to be seen, and here I am showing it to all you people. Probably just rolling up. I thought most of what he writes is very nautical. This is where the wind was coming from, this is whatever, but still he writes like a good 4 pages of the story. And that was, giving color to who the letter writer was, what the background was. His father had taken a trip. I don't think he ever took another trip, the father. So they certainly, Gus didn't. Gus traveled a lot by sea over the years. He must have gone around the world, I'm going to make up 14 times or something like that. But he did not enjoy his voyages. And maybe his father didn't either. But the sea was very close to everybody's heart in those days. If you lived on the North Shore of Boston and everything. And Eunice wrote, the boys in those days used to talk a great deal about going to sea. And that was because we lived near the sea, and they saw ships and sailors every day. And of course, we have some, what's his face? Winslow Homer. He just nails it with I think the feeling of what it must have been like in those days, with the young boy in the dory looking out at sea and wondering. But and this is a poem that I found that was written in Marblehead about 1900. The old clipper days were jolly when we sailed the 7 seas, and the house flags of our merchant ship were picked by every breeze. It was goodbye to your mother and the pretty girls on shore, for we're off around the howling horn, bound down to Singapore. We romped the rushing trade winds and we raced the big monsoon. We carried reeling royals from Manila to Rangoon. We were chased by Malay pirates from Matura to Penang, and we drove her scuppers under to outsail the cutthroat gang. There's obviously much more to the poem, but to me that really, maybe that's what that young man was thinking when he was up there on the prow of the boat. And then we have Gus's mother. Every person in the family tree opens a whole nother book, and here she is, Frederica, and she was not like any previous Farley spouse. She wasn't American, she wasn't even English, she was Swedish. And she was an adopted child who came over with a sea captain. And you could see she came from Göteborg. And I got to go there, and they have a wonderful place where they speak English really well, and you can try to chase down your ancestors. But if you don't know what parish they were in, it's a dead end. And it turns out that Newman is sort of a common last name, so that wasn't much help either. But she did come from a rather grand, purpose-built town about 1600. It was built up with the fortified walls and everything. So it wasn't like she was, came from nowhere, but she did come from a very, very poor family. And this is another piece of excitement. So one of the nice people in Sweden sent me the Göteborg tidings from 1832, and you can see that in yellow on the left-hand side, it has the incoming American brig, the Neptune, with Captain Gardner at the helm. So that is the fellow that came over, and this is the voyage that a person who was going to adopt her came on, and they had a cargo of sacks of Manila sugar and Muscovade sugar and bales of cotton and tea and tobacco and dye. I'm not sure if it's dye for cloth or whatever it is, but some kind of dye was in the cargo. And so that was very exciting to find proof that they did come over. And Eunice, the woman who wrote about the marbles, wrote a lovely story about the immigration story of her mother. Now, she was writing when she was about 80, and her audience was her grandnephews. So she wrote a very sweet story, and it was all about how her father, that the Gardners were good friends of the family. They came back and forth across the Atlantic many times and made friends with the Newmans, the captain, and Amelia's father was also a captain, and so they had that in common. And the Gardners, his wife sailed with him. She wasn't having any children. It wasn't happening. And they wanted to adopt little Amelia. And so, but the father said, you know, I just love to think of her when I'm on the rough and stormy sea at home, cozy in bed, waiting for me to come. But should a voyage come when I don't make it home, perhaps you could ask her mother if she is willing to let you adopt her. The mother is a little bit of a Cinderella situation. The mother had been a widow and had 3 older daughters, so it was a full house. And then one time came and the father was lost at sea. I could not find any record of it, though people were very kind at all the shipwrecks of Swedish vessels. And then little Amelia was adopted. The Gardners came back over and they took her to America, and it was all hunky-dory. Well, then in this cache of materials that I just got the last fall, I got the letter that was written by, or the story that was written by the elder daughter, not the second daughter, but the elder daughter who was living with the mother at the time. And it turned out that the father had died when Amelia was 2. So there was no thinking of you on the, while I'm at sea. And then the next piece was that that when the Gardners came over, they got off the ship and they were walking around. They said, does anybody know of any child that needs to be adopted? And then they were sort of told to go to the widow Newman's house, where she had her 3 older daughters to deal with and just a small pension to live on that I guess the Captain Newman hadn't left behind. And she said, sure, take Amelia, And then Amelia was meeting these people and getting to know them. And then one day, it was like, do you want to go on a carriage ride? And the next thing she knew, she was bundled, kicking and screaming onto a ship that had 1 sailor who spoke Swedish, and she was off to Boston. But it does say in both of them that somebody packed a nice little trunk for her. And in the trunk, our family has it, that she brought this lovely little bird over. And this was what one of the things that her family wanted her to bring back. And I just thought we share that with you. So there you have it with the 2 stories. And I think probably the second story is more likely. The elder daughter was a very perfectionist. She was living with her mother at the time. Her mother was alive, so she could have gotten the story straight from the horse's mouth. And she did end up being the first librarian of Radcliffe College. So I think she had a great understanding of, but when I say the first librarian, she started with a room with 5 books in it, and so it had ways to go. But anyway, so Amelia got to come, and they pretty soon she was up living with Mrs. Gardner's mother in Ipswich. And she got to go to a boarding school down Mr. Choate's school, which was a progressive school. And she got to high school. She got to really enjoy a year of school. But then, of course, Mrs. Gardner got pregnant. So Amelia got pulled out of school and had to go and take care of the little baby while the parents went back to sea. But I think she never forgot how much she enjoyed her education. And there she is. And here are the daughters, a little bit older than in that earlier picture that I gave you of the sisters, because the letters are pretty much family letters. So they're written to the mother and the father and the children. They're read out loud, and so he definitely. There are things that are not in the letters. He only mentions like seeing gypsies once and worrying about pickpockets, once, and being careful about the dissipation that he sees in London once. He doesn't go in, and it must have been his everyday. He walked for an hour and a half to work and an hour and a half home, so right through the city. So he did meet all kinds of things, experiences, but he didn't bother to share them with his family. And so the family had been living in Chelsea. Then they decide they need better education for their kids. So they moved to Grantville, which turns out to be Wellesley Hills, which is just a little near Newton, west of Boston. And Gus got to go to a very nice progressive school. And let me see if I can have a little bit to read. I can turn the page. See if I can get it just right. It was a progressive co-ed high school which admitted students of all racial backgrounds from all over the North, the islands, Cuba, Asia, Puerto Rico, and Europe. The curriculum was based on experiential learning and eschewed ruler-thrashing discipline. There we go. So he got that education. And then when he was 17 on the 4th of July, 1861, the Civil War was picking up speed. And as we know, it wasn't just war on land, it was also on the ocean because they didn't want the cotton to get sold so that the people in the South could buy guns and food, etc. So there he is, a young man, 17, and the war is picking up speed. And the next thing we know, in September, he has his passport and he's headed to Europe. And here is a description of him. 17, he's 5 feet 5.5 inches tall. His forehead is medium, his eyes are hazel, nose straight, mouth full, chin round, hair brown, complexion fair, and face long, and he's going to Europe. And we know that when he got there, he weighed himself at the docks and he weighed 129 pounds. By the time he left, he weighed 135 pounds. I always think those little details are just so much fun, but anyway. There we go. And in the first letter, you know, the next clue as to what is going on is he writes, I had a very pleasant passage. This is across the Atlantic. Regards to weather, but I was sick a greater portion of the voyage. George had a berth in the stateroom with me, which made it quite pleasant as I came more in contact with him, and he had a better opportunity of finding out what kind of chap I was. Well, I began to wonder, why did George need to know what kind of chap I was and who was George? So it turns out George is his first cousin. So he is going to Europe with his first cousin to help him go through the things. And so then I have to look into who are the Herds and who are the Farleys. And it turns out that both families lived in Ipswich and they had been known to each other for many years. And I put the little yellow line in there because that was where the family house is, and there's the Herd house. And during the Revolution, Mrs. Farley liked to have a little illicit cup of tea up at Mrs. Herd's house. So she must have, gone out and picked up and gone around because her husband wrote resolutions for the town of Ipswich. We said, no selling tea, no buying tea, no tea in town. He was the first selectman, and it was like there was going to be no tea in their household. Their household was stripped down. But tea is going to be a big part of Gus's life. So it's kind of curious. So how were they cousins? Then you find the family tree, and here is the Herd cousin's mother, and then down here at the tail end of the family is Gus Sr. And one of the funny things, I think, when you look at the numbers, all of a sudden you can see that Gus Sr. was born when his mother was 47. The last baby she had was when she was 42. And they were twins. So you kind of wonder, A, is this the illegitimate child of a child, a daughter beforehand? Or is it a super big surprise, But anyway, there is Gus Sr. turning up at the end. And it is the father, this wonderful miniature was painted in France, and he'd been a very successful mariner, and he'd come home and retired after 20 years at sea with $40,000. But by the end of the War of 1812, all his ships had been captured, and he was bankrupt. So you know how it's so different what number you are in the family. The daughters up here, they married very well. They were from a successful family, and there was lots of money. And then Gus is down here, and he ends up marrying an immigrant. For probably he doesn't have quite as much cushion left in the family, and the family may not be as prominent as it was. So it's always. But the family did stick together, and they were very good. And it seems like a very nice family, says me. So who were these cousins that Gus was? So George here, you saw him as a young man, and this is George in another 20 years later. So these are the George. We have Albert, George, John, and Augustine. And there are the parents with Elizabeth Farley. there, and they turned out to be international business people. And then you have to say international. So was the Suez Canal operated? Not yet. 69 is when it opened up. So everybody had to go all the way around Africa or around South America if they wanted to be in the international trade. And so that just gives you this world that Gus is entering into. And it turns out that the uncle of his cousins had been gone to sea in 1800 and been very successful on the seven seas, made a lot of money, retired. And then in 41, he decides to go to Canton or Gansu and start up a new firm. And he took the eldest cousin, John Hurd, with him as a 19-year-old boy. And they had quite an exciting time there. Do I have, let's see. A nice quote. I'd like to, if I'm reading somebody's words, it's nice to read the actual words. So Augustine and his nephew John were in Canton during the Opium Wars when the foreign settlement went up in flames. Hertz had about $500,000 in gold bullion on board. They had to trade in specie. There was no banks and anything. So if you were buying tea, you handed over your gold bullion or your Mexican silver dollars. And so they had treasuries in all the different little cantons. But anyway, these are the opium balls cured. I mean, it was a huge business. And there's the settlement in Canton going up. And John wrote, "It only remains for me to say that we owe everything to the coolness and presence of mind of Uncle Augustine. He encouraged us by his voice, animated us by his example, was everywhere, did everything, and to him belongs the credit of saving the vast amount of money." So they were carting all that bullion out of the treasury and into these little sampans in the river to get them upstream to Whampoa or toward where Hong Kong is. And there is a tea chest from the Penobscot Marine Museum, so you can see. And a tea chest can carry about 100 pounds of tea. And when they loaded them up, they would line them with lead so that for the long voyage, the tea wouldn't become, filled up with salt water. And then they had tissue in there, and then they put tissue around the outside. So it was quite a lot of steps, but 100 pounds of tea could be put into a tea box. And this is where the Hurds were when Gus was starting to be vetted by George or the family, the building to the, at this pointer, but anyway, this building here is where they lived. And it was pretty much like it was an expat community in Hong Kong. There was champagne, there was lots of French chefs, there was, quite a gentleman's life. In the course of my researches, I got to zoom in with one of John's children that came from his Chinese, Portuguese partner of, and they've lived a long life in Hong Kong, and they actually funded a seat at Bristol University to look into the Hurd family and do history for them, because he was very curious about that branch of his family. But he was very nice. And then these are the people that Gus is going to be working with when he gets off the boat in Hong Kong in 64. And I believe the partners get to be over here, and then on the other side are the clerks, and there's a dog or two in the picture, which is nice. And maybe a Chinese comprador there. So, London. Gus was going from Boston, which had 200,000 people, to London, which had 3 million people. So he couldn't help but be a little bit of a hayseed, a little bit, out of his a new experience for him. And here is delicate. So there are the Houses of Parliament, and Buckingham Palace is going to be over here. And then we're going to come over here to the Tower of St. Paul. And then way down here, you have London Bridge, and there is the Tower. And there is the Thames. And one of the huge differences between London and Boston is London is a harbor on a river, and Boston is a deep water harbor where you can just go right in to the docks and go out again. So it is quite a different situation. And of course, the Industrial Revolution was going on. So the city was being torn up and ripped up. And this is what it looked like being ripped up to put in the subway. The Metropolitan line was the first line to go in. And Gus would ride on it because it was a long walk to work and it was cheaper than the omnibus. And he did enjoy riding. It was kind of a cut and cover. So it would be out, you know, because it had just regular steam engines. So you'd go, you know, under a little overpass and then you'd be out in the open and over, you know, but it was still. And this is the square that Gus went through on his first day at work. Saturday morning, he wrote, I took a cab and drove down to Mr. Farron's office. That's going to be the person who's going to be his mentor. And he must have gone right through this intersection. I found Mr. Farron had not returned from Russia, but would probably be in London on Tuesday when everything would be arranged in reference to me. So I delivered my letters of introduction to his partner. This is when I began to realize several things, you know. So there he is going all the way across the Atlantic. He's 17. There's no job. Nobody's made, you know, so it's a little bit open-ended, a little bit more open-ended for this 17-year-old boy. His cousin George is in Paris. He didn't come into England with him, so he had to make his way from Southampton up to London by himself. And then the next thing is the partner is telling him that he doesn't have the right clothes. He doesn't have a tile. So there's another piece of research I did. What is a tile? A tile turned out to be a Spanish word for a top hat. And all the clerks have top hats. You know, if you think of Charles Dickens's things, you know, all the clerks have their little top hats. So the next little piece, the penny dropping, is that he writes home and he's very upset that this cost him 15 shillings. Now that doesn't sound like much, but then you try to do the math and it's like $200. So he came in and the first moment somebody has his hand in his pocket and he's taking out, you know, a good, you know, because he's got to pay for his room and board. And then because the other piece that happens is it's going to be an unpaid apprenticeship that he's doing in London. So his parents are back in the States. They're getting taxed really seriously by the war effort. And there are all the sisters coming along. And the father never ends up doing very well as a broker. So he's always writing home and saying, oh, I'm being so careful. I know that everybody's wearing, I have these gray pants that you made me, Mom, but I dyed them black because nobody wears gray pants. But they got a little tight, and I'm going to try to muscle through with my tight little black pants. But you know, you just feel for him that he's really working hard. By the end of the time, his time in London, he's a snappy dresser. He has a London tailor. The London tailor's in the 1900 address book that he has. So he did pick up, you know, a little bit of that. But he starts off probably by looking like a hayseed, you know, not wearing the right clothes, not you know, sometimes the pantaloons were tight, sometimes they were loose, and he was always just not quite wearing what he should have been wearing. And then I couldn't find out much about Charles Farron. Because I couldn't find his picture. I wanted so much to know what he looked like. But I could see that at one point he was a partner at Hertz, and he turned out to be a private banker in London and done that work. And he goes, Gus gets to go to his house often when he turns up, and he must have had a wonderful house south of London. And quite, you know, he had 2 sets of horses and lots of and one time Gus and Charles have been out for a walk and they come home. The maid is running out saying fire, 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 because they were airing some sheets in the upstairs room and they fell down behind the bureau and they caught on fire. And Gus gets the water from the hand washing thing and pours it on there. He's a hero. So I mean, there's just all these little vignettes that you get with letters. Now, what does Gus do? I couldn't figure out why was he in London if his cousins were in China doing the tea trade in there. Why isn't he in China? What's he doing there? Well, one of the first things he does, and this is from the Peabody Essex Museum, is copying, and this is actually a Herd notebook that they had there, and I just thought it was, just that handwriting that, this is before the Xerox machine, and so if you're writing letters around the world, you have to remember what it says 6 months later, it helps to have a copy. So a lot of these young people got to write, and this is just a chart for doing math. So you have the pounds of tea coming down this way, and then you have the different costs of tea going across, and then all the numbers, and then in the lower corner over there, you add on all those lovely things like insurance and freight and whatever else you need to know to find out how much a lot of tea is going to cost. So George turns out coming back and forth, and he says, the job that you have doing copying is not good enough. So he came and he stayed near Gus at St. James Park, which was cheaper, which was, like I said, a consideration for Gus. And George was very sweet, just telling him more and more of everything that they wanted him to know. But and George is on his way to China. So that was one of the first clues I got to the Chinese part. And so another thing that Gus did with this first place of apprenticeship was he would go to the custom house. And you figure that the custom house, the amount of money coming in through there from the whole British Empire must have been astounding, because if you had to pay duty on everything, it was amazing. And Gus would come down, he would pay the duty in the hall here for the company that he was working for, but he wasn't learning anything particular. So then it turns out that he changes who he's working for, and he's going to learn a skill. He's going to learn to be a tea taster. Now, twice you need to have tea tasters. You need to have them in London so you can inform buying the tea that's coming off the ships. And then you need to have them in China when you're buying the tea from the Chinese people. So there are two instances that having a good tea taster in your company is a useful skill. It turns out that George said, glad you like sampling. I abominated different tastes, apparently. I'll send you advice when I get time. Glad you like tea. Go ahead, that's all. But he gets lovely. The cousins are very nice to Gus. But the tea tasting, so you see, they go down and they get samples. They put them in all those little boxes and they label them. These are the teas coming off the ships. And then you put them up and you brew them up. You have a little pot, you boil the water. It can't be boiled twice, only once, because you lose too much oxygen. Then you make the tea, and it's very much like wine tasting or coffee tasting. You have a whole scale of, the smell, the color of the liquid, what the leaf looks like unfurled, and a variety of ways that you measure the tea. And what Gus was doing was tasting all these teas, and then in the auction catalog, you would put down what you would want to pay for them, and then the apprentices would go to the tea auctions and see how close they came to what the other people thought the tea was worth. There we go. But what did tea mean to Gus? Obviously, just back to the thing, we have our Boston Tea Party, and we have the illicit tea tasting, and then of course everybody kept their tea in lockable tea caddies because it was so valuable. And there is the tea auction that was done by the East India Company. It was very famous. And then there is that monopoly was closed, and they had public tea auctions on Mincing Lane, which you can read about them in a little bit. In Charles Dickens, he talks about Mincing Lane, the street of tea. And then, if I had known I was going to write it, I would have taken a better picture. But this is still one of my favorite pictures. You can see, if I can get this going here. Okay, so there is London Bridge, right there. And there is the custom house where the money comes in. And then over on the other side, you can see the Tower of London. And then coming down here, there are these buildings with ships inside. There are 3 of them on the side. And then you can see all the ships rafted up on the river. So I had heard of the bombing of the docks in World War II. I had no concept that the docks, because the Thames is a river, you can't have docks just the way we have them in Boston. So what the British did was they hollowed out basins on either side of the Thames. They lined them in great stone slabs. They built warehouses around the outside and that were fireproof and theft-proof. And so then they could bring in all the great, and then the ships used lock technology to come in off the river because, two of the problems besides the fact that the tide is going up and down, the ships are going up and down, and then you're trying to unload the ships in the middle of things on little lighters. There's a lot of pilfering going on, get your London Fog. That little ship didn't quite make it to the shore. So they're trying to make sure their goods make it to their proper destination and that they are secure until the duty's paid on them. Because you want to unload your ship and get your ship free, but you're not going to pay duty on things until they get sold. So let's see. So in 1860, there's a wonderful quote by a French person who was visiting the docks. The docks are filled with ships. Their innumerable riggings stretch a vast circle of spiderweb all around the rim of the sky. It is one of the mighty spectacles of our planet. The docks are prodigious, overwhelming, inhabited by a population of three-masted ships from every corner of the world. A merchant who had come to check the arrival of spices from Java and a transshipment of ice from Norway told me that about 40,000 ships enter these docks every year, and that as a rule there are between 5,000 and 6,000 in the docks at any given moment. And here is a close-up of St. Catherine's docks, and you can see the basin, the lock technology to let the water rise up, the ships go in, and then you have another set of locks. You can see you can get the ship right up next to where you're unloading it. And there's this is one of the lock gates. I mean, the Victorians have just cracked me up. I mean, they're willing to make something so big, to hold the water back. It's just like, just go for it. And then there's a beautiful photograph of a clipper ship right next to a 5-story, 6-story warehouse, and you can see how easy it is to unload it. Because this is Gus's world. Gus would come down here for the unloading of the ships, and this is you can see there's the mast of the ship that's being unloaded, and tea. And more tea. And then there's tea over here. And there's tea over there. And then there's a special trolley that you can see at the Docklands Museum that was made that could carry 2 chests of tea. Because, that'd be 200 pounds. So you don't want to be just, it's not like you're taking a tea bag that's coming off the ship. It's pretty serious stuff. And then this is what Gus did with his new job. If you see down in the lower right-hand corner, there is a top-hatted young gentleman who could be Gus, and he is not even waiting for the tea to come out of the hold. You can see the hold on right here, and down there are workers, and then there are some Chinese sailors, there's some longshoremen, there's some officers of the dock, and then the swarm of clerks coming down to get the first sample of this tea so they can take it home and test it. And then, I was trying to get a sense of how big this tea business was. And this is just tea all over, a huge heap of tea in a London warehouse. And what these fellows are doing is blending. The Americans liked green tea. They drank their tea pure, but the English liked English breakfast, and whatever. And so he's just blending it by eye over here and tamping it down in the box. And then I had to learn a little bit about how tea was made. At the top of the hill, there's my arrow. I've lost my arrow. Anyway, at the top of the hill, they are plowing a field, and then a little bit, and then a little bit further down, they're planting the trees, and then here they are beginning to pluck the trees, and the Chinese are processing the tea. Over here, you can see little fires underneath the tea. They would have a basket with about 5 pounds of tea in it, and that is fermenting the tea. Black tea and green tea are the same plant. It just depends how long it is cooked over fire, which is called fermenting. And then coming down here, and then when you get down to the bottom, you see they have a wall because they don't want the Westerners polluting, inland China. So they have a nice little wall to keep you out. These fellows are standing in the boxes of teas, and they are wearing spiky shoes, and they are tramping down the tea to get it packed into the tea box. Here they're putting the nails on, And here they're making records. Over here, they're using a way to weigh it so they know how much. Then it's going to go on the sampan. And this is a truncated view of taking the tea 17 miles down the Pearl River to where the Chinese allowed the Westerners to anchor their seagoing ships. And then here is your tea taster in China. And then that's just showing that how many, especially in China, they had so many different kinds of tea that it was important to have a tea taster so that you would get what you wanted. And then this is one of the last tea clippers. It's 212 feet long, 36 feet wide. The Cutty Sark, you can go on board it. You can go to England. It's at the Maritime Museum there. And then you're gonna have a little change of pace. So now we know what Gus was doing and how did he do socially. So the fellow in the middle in the white jacket is his best friend. So he gets to meet another young fellow at work who was a Scotsman who had a similar amount of money to spend, i.e. not very much. They boarded together and they did all kinds of fun things together. And they stayed friends because they both ended up in Japan for many years. And Gus definitely went through the fogs where you couldn't see where you were going. The streets were so nasty, you had to wear gaiters up to your knees because of the mud that would be churned up. And then you got to go on the Metropolitan Railway, which was exciting. And he got to play croquet. He wrote home and said, we're playing croquet here. It's a game that may not have gotten to America yet because it was just invented at the time of it. You know, it was kind of like, oh, okay. So there you go, seeing the first, you know. And then he went to dances. He had, through his connection with a fellow at church. He went to church and did just like your mother tells you, you know, meet people at church. He met an elder at church that had young daughters. They were from Nova Scotia, and they had dances and they had musical evenings and hay parties. So he did get out of town, but he just got like one day off. But it was worth it to go out and come back. He and Mollison went to Windsor Castle, and oh my goodness, they wrote both of them wrote huge long letters home to their parents. They were so interested in being that close to royalty, but otherwise they didn't see too much besides maybe a Lord Mayor's parade through town. And then the Crystal Palace was coming on board. And you got to go down there and see Blondine do acrobatic acts on a high wire. And then they went to Epsom races, which was, people watched the people coming home from the races just because they were all, well, there's the picture, they were jolly. There's another wonderful picture of the hoi polloi, everybody mixing together, the rich and the poor. This poor young fellow here, this clerk, you know, he looks like he's just bet his last money, unfortunately, on some money, and the horses are in the background behind the grandstand. There we go. And one of his cousins, Augustine Hurt, invited him to Paris, where he was living with his wife and young children for Christmas. So he got to go there and see Paris. And then he also got to go up to near Glasgow to Helensburgh, which is across the Clyde, and do all those English things, playing outside, hoping. And then back to tea for a little bit. Gus was actually in Shanghai in 1866 when the last big clipper race happened. And it was just an amazing. I just bring it in here. There were 40 ships that set out from Foochow pretty much on the same day. Three went out on the same tide. They went 14,000 miles in 99 days. They arrived within 28 minutes of each other at the mouth of the Thames with the New Seasons teas. They put up their flares to wait for the tug, and it was the steam tug that came first and took it in that won the race. And so it was really a sign of the change of times. There was another boat that was a steamship that left 15 days after the sailboats and arrived 8 days beforehand. It also had a cargo of 1 million pounds of tea, and it in addition had passengers. So the writing is on the wall, things are changing, but Gus was fine about that. He was not really into you know, into that, to the old, the romance of the sailors. He wrote, "Today I have been 20 miles down the Thames to see a friend of mine off to China. He sails in a beautiful double-screw steamer called the Far East. This is her first trip. She is going out to bring home the new season's teas and is considered one of the finest vessels of her kind afloat. My friend goes out as a tea taster. He was a very good friend to me when I first came over, and we have been friendly all along. I trust we shall meet someday in China." You know. And then it's time for Gus's trip to be over, and he goes home on the SS Africa out of Liverpool, because that's a shorter ways. The Thames didn't have, the mail boats went out from Liverpool, and 1 week they went to Boston, 1 week they went to New York. He managed to get one that was going to Boston. I think that's probably why he, there we go, and there he is on the manifest, and he wrote of his, with a bit of introspection, "It's wonderful how people change on leaving home and going abroad. It is but natural to suppose that I should become anglicized to a certain extent, but for all that, I'm a Yankee and not ashamed to own it." So he comes home, he spends the summer in without getting himself, what's the word, drafted into the army. I mean, maybe he's whatever, and then he is off, and here's his voyage to Hong Kong. He went 123 days straight, but they didn't stop. And about where this yellow sign piece here there, he says, "Oh, thank goodness it rained. It filled up the water barrels. We were going to run out of water." They, you know, the captain did not want to, but they didn't. They just didn't stop. He just kept on going, and here he is going across the yellow line. Here, 254 miles was the fastest that the captain had ever done in one day, and he was the main captain, Babcock. And then where it is yellow along there is just horrible weather. Just really, if you've seen that maiden voyage ship movie, well, anyway, it's not fun to go through there. And then he went up through Penang and all those places that were mentioned in the poem, the islands. And then we go past the Philippines, and then it's straight on home to Hong Kong. And there's what Hong Kong might have looked like when he was coming into shore. And there, you can imagine him having a nice cup of tea. Just like this voyage at the end.
Great.
Well, I guess I should say it. But
Yeah, do you have any questions?
Yes. Yes.
So he was in London for 2 years, and then he went home. Did he just turn around and go to Hong Kong, or how long was he home?
He was home long enough to apprentice in the New York office of the Herds. So he got to know how that office functioned. And I think he was home he wasn't expecting to be able to go home. When he went to London, he thought he was going to go straight on to China because of the war. But yeah, it was just maybe 3 months at home.
I was curious how it was so easy for him to leave the country when we were starting a war. Like, you know, kind of, it was a wonderful opportunity, and on the other hand, he was allowed to go.
I think that's interesting. I mean, because it was early days in the war, you know, maybe things hadn't gotten. I mean, he definitely wrote a lot about it. There was a lot in the newspaper, and you can read the letters and find out what he thought. But he was very happy that he wasn't a warrior. He had not a bone in his body that wanted to be there, you know. And
I wonder if that's precipitated his second trip over, because then it was getting worse then.
He could pay somebody else. You could pay somebody else to take your place. But the draft didn't start till 63 and 82 or 63. So he may have scooted out just in
He
time.
might have done.
yeah, I think he left before the draft, and he dipped back in when the war was almost, you know,
64.
64. So it was less compelling. But you know, I think personally for his family, he was the one boy, you know, so a ne'er-do-well father, one boy who's he writes in his first going over that, "I want to be a shining light for my family." So I think he saw that it was up to him to be willing to leave home, go to China, and earn enough money for the 4 daughters that were, you know, because the mother came with nothing. she, you know, when the immigrant mother, she didn't have any kind of a cushion. It wasn't, you know, a good marriage or whatever. So that's my guess. But
That's a lot of dowries to fill.
yeah, I think that the earlier ones, there was definitely money on both sides of the family. And by the time Gus's father came along, there was no money, and then Gus's father wasn't very good at making money. I mean, Gus actually writes about it. You know how it is with our family. My father has had many reverses. So.
And the adoptive parents were not giving mothering. The adoptive parents were not.
You know, they never talk about Sweden. Both of the older daughters go over to Europe and they get to Germany. Nobody thinks of going to Sweden. No, there's no, you know, there's no Swedish words that come down in the family like we use this word. You know, there's no recipes that came down. None. But the chest that was packed, you know, that came down. That came down.
The tea trade between London and Hong Kong always went by way of Africa.
I think so. I think going around, I mean, I think you could go the other way. The 2 years before the mast went the other way to get the
weather's even worse there.
but the weather's pretty horrible. Yeah.
Forest.
So I guess it's just which horrible weather you want. And George, when he went to China, went overland, which means he took a train across France. He went all the way down Italy. He got on Brindisi. He got on a ferry boat, went over to Egypt. Then you do the overland place where you go on a you can take camels. You go across the desert to the top of the Red Sea, and you get another steamboat, and then you go to Calcutta, you know, to India, you know, and down along. Yeah. So it was so there was an overland way to go, but it was too expensive for the tea for cargo.
How long did he stay in China?
He ended up so he was in China, mostly in Shanghai until 66. Summer of 66, he went to Japan to run the Yokohama office of Herds, and he stayed there till 82. So he and Mollis and his friends, all the 4 young men in 1880 go home and get married and bring their wives out to Japan. It was very funny. So they were, you know, 15 years doing tea in Japan, but they spent many years there. But when his wife, my grandmother, came out, this actually was given to her by the comprador, who was the Chinese head of business at their firm. So it was a wedding present that she got, and she built a house. She had a baby, and she got sick, and so they came home to New York. She just didn't seem to be able to be well enough to want to stay in Japan. And the weather sounds like it's very difficult, you know, before air conditioning and everything. It was hot, wet, you know, and very, very difficult. But anyway.
Then they settled in Boston.
No, New York. They were in New York. And he died when he was 54 of appendicitis. They operated on him on his dining room table, and then I think, you know, they didn't use clean, you know, for whatever reason, he was soon dead. And she lived another 30 years after.
This was your grandmother.
That was my grandmother, yeah.
So is the family still dabbling in tea?
No, we're just drinking it. No, actually, you know, if you did the story of, if you know that, which I didn't, but I understand that the economic climate, worldwide climate, was horrible in the second half of the 19th century, and like 25% of the businesses in the U.S. went bust and stuff like that, and twice firms that he was dealing with, somebody stole $250,000. And the first time was Herds, and that was in 75. So Herds ended up closing, and the brothers got together and they pooled all their money and they paid all their debts so that they weren't, you know, leaving anything. But then they were done. That was it. They were just flat out, and they had been the #1 biggest American firm in Hong Kong in 62. And then by 75, you know, too much champagne, too many French cooks, and whatever. And they would just run through it all. They, you know, they thought they could live the high life, and then they didn't make good decisions. And they wanted to do a commission business, which was they wouldn't want to buy something unless they had a buyer back home. Whereas if you do things on spec, you know, you turn up with a whole bunch of tea and then you sell it. That's another way of doing it. But and then Gus himself, a few years before he died, an American business worker of his, employee of his, ran away with $250,000 to Canada out of Chicago. And so my grandmother's father footed the bill to get them over to pay off all their debts. And then I think they just closed. Or they sold it to another fellow from Bowdoin, Maine, Barnum. He took over. But it was like, it wasn't very secure business, you know. So there was no extra money coming from the tea business.
So you obviously visited a lot of places. You kind of said, how did things come to you? Like, how did you put this together? What are your missing pieces that you're still looking for?
Well,
that was a lot of questions.
Yeah, right. I know, because you know, it's like sometimes you didn't know what you don't know. That was, you know, like I was telling in the front row, the letters said, you know, going via Queenstown. Well, I couldn't find Queenstown for the longest kind of time, and it turned out to be Cork. And Cork, Ireland, you know, was just Queenstown for like 20 years or something. You know, and that's kind of one of those secret things that people who know the field, you know, just, oh, of course, you know, but me, if Queenstown, is it going down to, you know, whatever. So I don't know what I don't know, which is a problem. And I just study things, you know, kind of in depth as they came across. You know, you can see, oh, I got interested in the docks, and no, I got interested in the tea, and I got interested in the various things to try to figure out what his life was like. So I can't really answer that. Yeah, it was very fun.
When did you find the letters and get to the point that you wrote the book?
I mean, probably, I don't know, probably 15 years, you know, but it's a wonderful excuse to travel. I mean, you know, if Eiffel Tower, you know, will be there, whatever, but to go and think, oh, this is the street where he lived, and this is where the docks were, this is where, you know, where these things, and I went to Japan, and you get to meet really nice people that are interested in history. They were a nice group of people. You know? So I got to meet a very nice English fellow who was Gus's best friend, who was interested in Gus's best friend, because he was interested in cricket, and he was interested in rugby, and you know, whatever. So this whole other world opened up, you know, and he married several Japanese women, and so he had a whole different view of the world, you know. So that's been nice. Yeah, but it's been a great journey. It kept me out of jail. It's a plus, right? You know?